The night I learned how thin walls really are. I was 9 years old and counting the cracks in the ceiling because I was afraid to sleep. The house was quiet in the way a forest goes quiet right before a storm. Too still, too alert, holding its breath. I knew that silence. It wasn't peace. It was a warning. My father's car had pulled into the driveway an hour earlier. I hadn't heard the engine, but I'd heard the keys. That dull metallic clink against the doorframe that told my mother everything she needed to know. One short, careless hit meant he was drunk but manageable. 2 sharp collisions meant we should stay invisible. 3 meant we should disappear. That night, there were 3. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat. Even at that age, I understood something no child should have to understand. If you stay quiet enough, you might not be noticed. If you aren't noticed, you might not be hurt. The smell came before the voice. Alcohol, cheap and sour, spreading through the house like a fog. My stomach tightened the way it always did, as if my body recognized the danger faster than my mind could form words. I heard my mother moving in the kitchen, slow and careful, every step measured. She was already preparing herself, already adjusting her posture, her tone, her face. Robert Carter was a good man once. That's what my mother said. Over and over. Like a prayer she hoped would become true if she repeated it enough times. "He's not bad," she would whisper to me later, when the house was quiet again and she was pressing a cold cloth to my cheek or her own split lip. Life just broke him. I learned early that broken things were dangerous. When my father spoke, it was never loud at first. He started soft, almost tender, words slurring together. He would ask where dinner was, why the house smelled strange, why the TV was too loud or too quiet. The questions were traps. There was no correct answer. My mother knew that. She still tried. I heard a chair scrape against the floor, a glass set down too hard. My name floated down the hallway like a threat. "Emily!" I held my breath. If I didn't move, maybe he'd forget. Maybe he'd pass out on the couch. Sometimes that happened. Those were good nights. Not this one. The door to my room opened without a knock. The hallway light framed his silhouette, broad and unsteady. His eyes found me instantly. They always did. I think he hated how much I looked like my mother. Or maybe he hated how much fear he saw reflected back at him. "Why are you awake?" he asked, as if I'd committed a crime. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Any sound felt dangerous. He stepped closer. The smell of alcohol wrapped around me, heavy and unavoidable. "She can't sleep," my mother said from the doorway behind him. Her voice was calm, too calm. "She had a nightmare." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Figures." The first time he hit me, I didn't cry. I remember that clearly. It surprised him. I think it surprised me too. I just stared at him, shocked more by the betrayal than the pain. Fathers weren't supposed to do that. Somewhere, deep inside, a child's logic tried to reassert itself. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe it wouldn't happen again. It did. Sometimes it was a slap, sometimes a shove. Sometimes his hand would close around my arm just hard enough to leave fingerprints that my mother would later cover with long sleeves and explanations. I learned how to fall so it hurt less. I learned how to stay silent. I learned how to disappear inside my own head. My mother learned how to lie. "He tripped," she told relatives when they noticed the bruises. "I'm clumsy." "He's under a lot of stress," she said when his temper exploded in public. "Work has been hard." At night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her cry, quietly, correctly, invisibly, just like she taught me. I hated him. That part was easy. What confused me was how much I loved her and how angry I was at her at the same time. She protected him more fiercely than she ever protected herself. Or me. And yet, every time I imagined leaving, my chest tightened with panic. What would happen to her if I wasn't there? If I wasn't a witness? If I wasn't another body in the room to absorb the damage? Fear became routine, like brushing my teeth, like doing homework. It wasn't dramatic. It was constant. A low hum beneath everything else. I learned to read moods, anticipate explosions, measure silence. I learned that love could hurt, and that apologies didn't mean safety. By the time I was a teenager, the house felt smaller than ever. The walls pressed in. The air felt heavy. I stopped inviting friends over. I stopped talking about home. I became good at pretending everything was normal, but nothing was. The screaming always came eventually. And when it did, it shattered whatever illusion of calm we'd managed to build. Every fight sounded the same. His voice, sharp and accusing. My mother's, soft and apologetic. The thud of something hitting something else. The silence afterward. That silence was the worst, because it meant tomorrow would come, and nothing would change. My mother loved my father in a way that scared me more than his fists ever did. She loved him fiercely, blindly, like love was a shield that could stop bruises midair if she held it tightly enough. When he hurt her, she folded inward and explained it away. When he hurt me, she apologized for him before I could even process what had happened. Her loyalty to him was absolute, even when his loyalty to us didn't exist at all. "He didn't mean it," she would say, kneeling in front of me, her hands shaking as she touched my face. "You know that, right? He just loses control sometimes." I wanted to scream that losing control wasn't an excuse, that broken men didn't get permission to break everyone else. But I stayed quiet. I had already learned that truth made things worse. She became an expert at cleaning up after him. Not just the mess, glasses, overturned chairs, shattered plates, but the consequences. She memorized excuses like lines from a play she'd been forced to perform in every day. "He's tired. He didn't sleep. He's under pressure. He still loves us." I watched her lie to relatives, to neighbors, to doctors. Once, when a nurse gently asked about the bruises on her arms, my mother smiled and said she'd fallen down the stairs. She laughed, like it was a silly thing, and the nurse nodded, relieved to accept the answer. Everyone always accepted the answer. It was easier that way. At night, when my father finally passed out, the house smelled like alcohol and regret. My mother would sit on the edge of my bed, brushing my hair with slow, careful movements, as if she were afraid I might break too. "You have to understand him," she whispered. "He didn't grow up like you. He had it worse." Worse than what? Worse than fear? Worse than learning how to listen for keys instead of footsteps? Worse than flinching every time a voice got louder than necessary? I hated him. That was simple. What complicated everything was that I started to resent her too. Not because she was weak, but because she chose him over safety, again and again. Because she taught me that love meant endurance, that staying was more noble than leaving, that surviving quietly was better than fighting loudly. And yet, every time I imagined leaving her alone with him, panic wrapped around my chest so tightly I could barely breathe. I pictured his anger with no witness, no buffer, no one to step between them if things went too far. The guilt of even thinking about escape made me feel like a traitor. So I stayed. I became her shadow. I learned how to stand slightly in front of her when he was drunk. I learned how to speak softly enough to calm him, but not so softly that he thought I was mocking him. I learned how to watch his hands more than his face. Faces lied. Hands didn't. There were moments, small, dangerous moments, when my mother would look at me with something like doubt in her eyes, as if she saw what I was becoming and didn't like it. Those moments never lasted. "He loves you," she insisted once after he shoved me hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. "He just doesn't know how to show it." I didn't answer. I pressed my face into my pillow that night and realized something terrifying. I no longer trusted her version of reality. Love, in our house, was a weapon. It excused everything. It erased consequences. It turned violence into a misunderstanding and fear into loyalty. My mother wore her love like armor, but it only protected the person hurting us. Sometimes I wondered if she was more afraid of being alone than she was of being hit. That thought made me feel cruel, ungrateful, but it also felt true. I stopped asking her why she stayed. I stopped begging her to leave. Every time I did, she would cry, and then apologize, to me, for making me worry. She told me families stayed together, that good daughters didn't abandon their parents. That love meant sacrifice. I learned that silence wasn't just survival. It was expected. Every night, as I lay in bed, I played out the same thought over and over. If tomorrow he hits harder, I won't be able to stop him. I imagined myself stepping in, imagined myself failing. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It was mathematical. How much force, how much damage, how little control. I began to understand something that terrified me even more than my father. Nothing would change on its own. Not his drinking, not his rage, not my mother's devotion to the man who hurt her. Love was keeping us trapped. And deep down, in a place I didn't yet have the words for, I knew that one day I would have to choose between protecting her and saving myself. I didn't wake up one morning brave. There was no dramatic moment where I looked in the mirror and decided I was done being afraid. Courage didn't arrive like clarity. It crept in slowly, disguised as exhaustion. I was tired of measuring my footsteps, tired of reading moods, tired of calculating how much space I needed to leave between my body and his temper. Mostly, I was tired of surviving instead of living. The decision formed quietly, the way everything dangerous in my life always had. Late at night, lights off, my mother asleep in the next room, my father snoring on the couch, an empty bottle rolling slightly every time he shifted. I stared at the ceiling and realized something that felt almost like betrayal. If I stayed, this would be my whole life, not just now, not just until I finished school or got a job or moved out someday. This house would follow me. This fear would follow me. I would carry it into relationships, into work, into every version of myself that tried to exist outside these walls. I couldn't do that. The idea of the army came to me the way forbidden thoughts often do, uninvited and immediately terrifying. I had never said it out loud, not even to myself. It felt absurd. Me, Emily Carter, the quiet girl, the one who flinched at raised voices, the one who learned to disappear rather than confront. But the more I thought about it, the more it scared me, and the more right it felt. The army didn't care if you were afraid. It didn't negotiate. It didn't ask about your childhood. It broke you or it didn't. And something inside me wanted that. Wanted to be tested by something that wasn't my father's rage. Wanted to find out if there was anything solid inside me that fear hadn't already eaten away. I didn't tell my mother. That was the hardest part. I imagined her face folding in on itself, imagined her voice full of concern and disbelief. "You won't last." She wouldn't mean it cruelly. She would mean it protectively. She would say it the way she said everything meant to keep me small and close and safe inside her fear. And I was terrified my father would laugh. I could hear it already. The sharp, dismissive sound. The way his eyes would scan me like I was something ridiculous. "You?" he'd say. "You think you're tough enough for that?" I couldn't let them take this from me before it even began. So I lied. I told them I'd found work out of state. Nothing exciting, temporary, just something to save a little money. I practiced the lie in my head until it sounded boring enough to be believable. I didn't make eye contact when I said it. I kept my voice flat. My father barely reacted. He nodded once, already halfway into another drink. My mother asked 100 questions. Where? Doing what? With whom? I answered all of them carefully, building a version of myself she could accept. A version that wasn't threatening. A version that wasn't leaving her. The night I left, the house was quiet again. Real quiet this time. No tension, no waiting. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. I packed lightly. I didn't take anything sentimental. No photos, no childhood objects. I was afraid they would anchor me, afraid I'd turn back if I carried too much of the girl I was trying to escape. I stood in the hallway for a long time, looking at my mother's door. My hand hovered inches from the wood. I wanted to wake her, to tell her the truth, to tell her I was scared, to ask her to come with me. But I knew she wouldn't. She would choose him. Again. And I didn't trust myself to walk away if she begged me to stay. So I left without goodbyes, without promises, without saying who I would become. Outside, the air felt different, colder, sharper, like it belonged to someone else. I took one last look at the house. It looked smaller from the outside, less powerful, just a structure full of bad memories. As the bus pulled away, fear hit me all at once. Not the familiar fear of him, a new one, bigger, louder, fear of failure, fear of being exposed as exactly what everyone thought I was, weak, fragile, not built for hardship. But underneath it, there was something else, relief. For the first time in my life, the future wasn't a continuation of the past. It was a question mark, terrifying and open and mine. I didn't leave because I was brave. I left because staying would have killed something in me that I wasn't ready to let die. The Army didn't make me strong. Not at first. First, it stripped me down to nothing and dared me to prove I deserved to exist there. The moment I arrived, I understood how naive I had been. I'd imagined discipline, training, maybe even purpose. What I got instead was noise. Constant, aggressive, unavoidable noise. Shouting before dawn. Orders thrown like weapons. Faces hard with indifference. No one cared who I was, where I came from, or what I'd survived. I wasn't special. I wasn't fragile. I was just another body that needed to be broken into shape. The first night, I lay on a narrow bunk staring at a ceiling even more unfamiliar than the one back home. My muscles ached in places I didn't know existed. My throat burned from holding back tears all day. Around me, other women slept, groaned, shifted. No one cried out loud. Weakness had rules here, and one of them was silence. The cold came next. It crawled under my clothes, into my bones, refused to leave. Morning started before my body understood it was awake. Boots hit the floor in unison. Someone always moved too slow. Someone always paid for it. Sometimes that someone was me. Move faster, Carter. Is that all you've got, Carter? You planning to quit today, Carter, or save it for tomorrow? Every word landed like a test. Not just of endurance, but of identity. I'd spent my whole life learning how not to be noticed. Here, invisibility was failure. You either stood your ground or you disappeared completely. My body betrayed me constantly in those first weeks. Hands shaking, legs burning, breath coming too fast. I'd bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood just to stay focused. Pain was easier than panic. Pain made sense. The humiliation was worse. Being yelled at inches from my face, being corrected publicly, being reduced to mistakes. Back home, anger had always meant danger. Here, it was procedural, systematic, relentless, and my nervous system didn't know the difference. There were nights I cried into my pillow, silently, like I'd done as a child. The familiarity of that almost broke me. I hated that fear followed me here. I hated that even now, even after leaving, I still felt like that small girl waiting for the next blow. More than once, I thought about quitting. The thought crept in during the worst moments, when my arms shook too badly to hold position, when my lungs felt like they were tearing, when a voice inside my head whispered, "You don't belong here." It told me I could go back, that no one would blame me, that this was too much to ask of someone like me. Every time that thought appeared, another followed right behind it. Home, the smell of alcohol, the sound of keys, my mother's quiet apologies, the way fear lived in my chest like a permanent resident. And suddenly, quitting didn't feel like relief. It felt like surrender. There was a moment, small, almost unremarkable to anyone watching, that became my breaking point. We were standing in formation in freezing rain, uniforms soaked, teeth chattering. Someone ahead of me faltered. The instructor exploded, screaming at all of us, punishing everyone for one person's weakness. The unfairness of it hit me like a slap. I felt it then. That old, familiar urge to shrink, to disappear, to endure quietly. Instead, something in me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a clean internal break. I realized I was already living the worst thing I'd been afraid of. I was being yelled at, pushed, tested, and yet, no one was hitting my mother. No one was breaking into my room at night. No one owned me. This pain had an end. That understanding didn't make it easier, but it made it possible. I stopped crying after that. Not because it stopped hurting, but because I stopped arguing with the pain. I stopped waiting for it to pass and started moving through it. One order at a time. One breath at a time. One refusal to quit at a time. I learned that endurance wasn't loud. It didn't look heroic. It looked like standing there soaked and shaking and choosing not to step out of line. Every day asked the same question: will you quit or will you stay? And every day, despite fear, despite doubt, despite the part of me that still wanted to run, I stayed. Not because I was strong, but because going back was no longer an option. Strength didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. In moments so small, I almost missed them. The first time I realized something had changed was during a morning run. Cold air burned my lungs, my boots hit the ground in steady rhythm, and for once, my thoughts weren't screaming at me to stop. My body moved before fear could interfere. I wasn't forcing it. I wasn't bargaining with myself. I was just doing it. That scared me more than weakness ever had. Because weakness had been familiar. It had shaped my childhood, my instincts, the way I occupied space. Strength was unknown territory. It required responsibility. If I could endure this, then what excuse would I have left for accepting what I'd once survived? The Army didn't soften. It didn't praise. It didn't tell me I was doing well. Progress wasn't announced. It was assumed. You either kept up or you were corrected until you did. Somewhere between drills and inspections, between bruises and sore muscles, my body stopped arguing with the commands. Obedience came first. Confidence followed. My shoulders squared without me thinking about it. My gaze lifted naturally. When someone barked my name, I answered without hesitation. The word no stopped catching in my throat. I learned to say it clearly, without apology, without explanation. Fear didn't disappear. That surprised me. I'd imagined strength as the absence of fear, some clean transformation where panic evaporated and was replaced by certainty. That wasn't how it worked. Fear still came. It just stopped being in charge. I began to recognize the sensation in my body, the tight chest, the shallow breath, not as a warning, but as information. My body telling me something mattered. Something was at stake. Fear became a signal, not a command. There were moments of doubt, of course. Nights when exhaustion cracked my composure and I lay awake wondering who I was becoming. I wasn't the girl I'd been, but I wasn't sure who I was replacing her with. Strength felt lonely sometimes. There was no one to hide behind anymore. And yet, I felt more real than I ever had. I watched others quit. Some loudly, angrily, some quietly with shame in their eyes. I didn't judge them. I understood the cost. Every day demanded a piece of you. Not everyone wanted to pay it. What surprised me was that I did. Not because I enjoyed the hardship, I didn't. But because with every week that passed, I felt something inside me solidify, like metal cooling after being forged, bent, heated, struck, then set into a shape that wouldn't bend the same way again. One afternoon, during a training exercise, someone shouted in my face without warning. The sound echoed sharply, sudden and aggressive. Instinct kicked in. My body tensed, but I didn't flinch. The realization hit me seconds later. Back home, that sound would have sent me spiraling. My heart would have raced. My hands would have gone numb. I would have disappeared inward, bracing for impact that might or might not come. Here, I stood my ground. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. Power wasn't dominance. It wasn't shouting louder or hitting harder. Power was the ability to remain present when everything in you wanted to retreat. I stopped thinking about my father as often, not because I'd forgiven him, but because he no longer occupied the center of my internal world. He wasn't the measure of danger anymore. He wasn't the voice defining my limits. For the first time, my future didn't feel like a reaction to my past. I began to imagine returning home, not as a fantasy of rescue or revenge, but as a fact. One day, I would stand in that house again. The thought no longer filled me with dread. It filled me with resolve. Strength, I learned, isn't given. It's taken. Taken in early mornings when your body begs for rest and you refuse. Taken in moments of fear when you stay instead of running. Taken in silence, without witnesses, without applause. I wasn't fearless, but fear no longer owned me, and that changed everything. I came back without telling anyone. No uniform, no announcement, no version of myself on display. I wore ordinary clothes, the kind that let you blend in, the kind that didn't explain anything. Part of me wanted to walk through the door, transformed and undeniable. Another part needed to see the truth first, needed to know whether the house had changed or if I had only learned how to endure it better. The bus dropped me off 2 streets away. I walked the rest, each step slower than the last. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Same cracked sidewalks, same sagging fences, same illusion of normalcy. It was unsettling how untouched everything felt, like time had politely waited for me to return before continuing. The house appeared at the end of the street, small and familiar. Too familiar. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a strange, distant awareness, as if I were observing my own past rather than stepping back into it. I stopped for a moment, listening. Silence. That alone should have warned me. Inside, the air smelled stale. Old furniture, old walls, and beneath it all, that unmistakable undertone I'd hoped I was imagining. Alcohol. It hadn't left. It never did. My body cataloged the information automatically, the way it always had. Exit routes, corners, sounds. Some instincts don't disappear. They just wait. My mother was in the kitchen. She looked older, smaller. When she turned and saw me, her face collapsed into shock, then relief, then something dangerously close to guilt. "Emily?" Her voice trembled. "You didn't say you were coming." I hugged her before she could say anything else. She felt fragile in my arms, lighter than I remembered. For a moment, I was just her daughter again. For a moment, I let myself forget why I'd left. "He's asleep," she whispered, as if saying his name might summon him. "Drank too much." Of course he had. The house hadn't changed. The furniture was in the same places. The pictures on the walls still smiled their fake smiles. It was like stepping into a preserved memory, one I'd spent months trying to outgrow. The difference was subtle, but profound. I no longer felt trapped inside it. Then he woke up. The sound of his voice carried down the hallway, rough and irritated. He stumbled into the living room, eyes unfocused, expression already curling into that familiar sneer. When he saw me, confusion flickered briefly across his face before settling into recognition. "Well, look who's back," he said. "Thought you ran off for good." I studied him calmly, the slouch, the unsteady stance, the arrogance that came from years of never being challenged. He was exactly the same. Something in me settled. "Hi, Dad," I said evenly. My voice didn't shake. I noticed that first. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You look different," he said, not kindly. "Too thin." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence wasn't submission anymore. It was choice. The tension built quickly. It always did. He complained about the house, about the noise, about nothing in particular. My mother shrank under his words, shoulders rounding, eyes dropping. I watched it happen with a clarity that hurt worse than memory. This was what I'd left behind. This was what had continued without me. The first blow came suddenly, a sharp sound. My mother stumbled, hitting the edge of the table as she fell. Time slowed in a way that felt almost clinical. I was already moving. I stepped between them before my thoughts could catch up. When he raised his hand again, I caught his wrist mid-swing. My grip was firm, controlled, precise. Training took over. I twisted his arm just enough to break his balance, just enough to make him feel it. He froze. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me with fear. "Let go," he hissed, trying to pull free. "No," I said calmly. The word landed differently than it ever had before. I released him slowly, deliberately. He backed away a step, then another. His breathing was uneven. His confidence cracked, just slightly, and I saw something ugly and small beneath it. The house was silent again, but this time it wasn't waiting to explode. It was listening, and for the first time, so was he. There are moments that divide a life into before and after. You don't always recognize them when they happen. Sometimes they feel strangely ordinary, almost quiet. Later, when you look back, you realize nothing was ever the same again. That moment came for me in the hallway, with my father standing a few steps away, his hand still hovering in the air where it had failed to land. The silence was thick, heavy. Not the fearful quiet I'd grown up with, not the fragile pause before the next explosion, but something unfamiliar, unstable. He didn't know what came next. That was new. My mother was on the floor, leaning against the table, her breath shallow. She hadn't cried out. She never did. She just looked up at me, eyes wide, filled with a mixture of shock, fear, and something I'd never seen there before. Hope. It terrified me. My father tried to recover first. He always did. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and his mouth twisted into that familiar sneer he used when he felt his authority slipping. "What the hell was that?" he snapped. "You think you can touch me now?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move closer. I didn't step back either. I stood exactly where I was, feet grounded, spine straight, hands relaxed at my sides. The calm came naturally, like muscle memory. "I think you're drunk," I said. "And I think you're done." He laughed, loud this time, too loud. It was the laugh of a man trying to convince himself he was still in control. "You don't scare me," he said. He was lying. We both knew it. I knelt beside my mother, helping her up slowly, checking her the way I'd been trained to check injuries. Methodical, detached, effective. She winced, but nodded when I asked if she could stand. I positioned myself slightly in front of her without thinking. The movement was instinctive, protective. My father noticed. His eyes darkened. That look used to freeze me in place, used to make my stomach drop and my vision blur. Now it did something else entirely. It sharpened my focus. "Get out of my way," he growled. "No." Again, the word came easily, clean, solid. Something inside him snapped. He lunged forward, not fast, not controlled, sloppy, angry, predictable. I reacted before he finished the motion. I stepped in, caught his arm, and twisted. Harder this time. Not enough to break anything. Enough to make the point. He cried out, a sound of surprise more than pain, and stumbled backward, nearly falling. My mother gasped. I let go immediately. I wasn't there to punish him. I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there to end it. Don't, I said quietly. Ever again. He stared at me like I was a stranger, like he was trying to reconcile the image of the girl he'd controlled for years with the woman standing in front of him now. His chest rose and fell unevenly, sweat mixed with alcohol on his skin. This is my house, he said weakly. No, I replied. This is where you lived while we were afraid of you. The words surprised me as they left my mouth, not because they weren't true, but because I'd never allowed myself to say them before. He opened his mouth to argue, to threaten, to fall back on the same tired patterns. Nothing came out. For the first time, he had no script. I reached for my phone. The movement alone made him flinch. I'm calling the police, I said, calmly, as if announcing the weather. I'm reporting domestic violence. There's a record. There will be consequences. You wouldn't, he said. You don't have the guts. I met his eyes. I already left, I said. That should have told you everything. I made the call. My mother cried then, softly at first, then harder, covering her mouth as if she were afraid to be heard. I didn't stop. I didn't look at her. I didn't hesitate. I gave the address. I described what happened. I used words I'd never been allowed to use before. Hit, threatened, afraid. Each word felt like pulling a thorn out of my own skin. My father backed away toward the hallway, his bravado draining with every sentence. He looked small, older, less certain. He sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the floor. By the time the call ended, the house felt different. Not safe, not yet, but altered. Like a door had been opened that could never be closed again. I turned to my mother. It's over, I said. She shook her head, tears streaking her face. He'll change, she whispered. He always says, no, I interrupted gently. This time, he doesn't get to. She looked at me then, really looked. Not at her child. Not at the girl she'd tried to protect by keeping her small. At the woman who stood between her and violence without hesitation. The woman who wasn't afraid anymore. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't about strength. It was about permission. And I had finally taken mine. The police didn't arrive with sirens. That detail stayed with me. No dramatic sound to announce the end of something that had defined our lives for decades. Just headlights washing over the front of the house, tires crunching softly on gravel, a knock that was firm but controlled, the kind of knock that assumes cooperation. My father straightened when he heard it, not with confidence, with instinct. Years of entitlement taught him how to perform innocence. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smoothed his shirt, tried to arrange his face into something reasonable. I watched him do it with a detached fascination, like observing an old trick that no longer worked. My mother sat on the edge of a chair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She looked smaller than ever, wrapped in fear and loyalty, and the terrible habit of minimizing her own pain. When she glanced at me, I saw the question in her eyes. Is it too late to stop this? I shook my head slightly. No anger, no accusation, just certainty. It's already done. The officers were professional, calm. One man, one woman. They separated us immediately, as if following a script written long before we ever needed it. The female officer spoke to my mother softly, guiding her into the kitchen. The male officer stayed in the living room with my father. And me. I explained what had happened. I didn't dramatize. I didn't soften it either. I used facts, times, actions. I spoke like someone who had learned that clarity is a form of power. The officer nodded, asked a few questions, took notes. He believed me. That alone felt like something cracking open inside my chest. My father tried to interrupt. She's exaggerating, he said, waving a hand. Family argument. That's all. The officer held up a finger without looking at him. Sir, you'll have your turn. That sentence changed everything. My father went quiet. I watched the realization spread across his face slowly, like ink in water. He wasn't the center anymore. He wasn't in control of the narrative. For the first time, someone else was deciding what mattered. When the officer finally turned to him, my father launched into excuses, stress, drinking, misunderstandings. He said my mother was emotional, that I was dramatic, that things got out of hand. He never said it didn't happen. The officer listened, impassive. When he finished, there was a pause, just long enough to be uncomfortable. Sir, the officer said, you need to pack a bag? The words landed heavily in the room. What? My father snapped. This is my house. Not tonight, the officer replied evenly. You'll be leaving. My mother let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. She covered her mouth again, eyes filling. I couldn't tell if she was terrified or relieved. Maybe both. Probably both. My father looked at me then. Really looked. Not with anger, not with contempt, with calculation. You did this, he said quietly. Yes, I answered. No apology, no justification, just truth. He stood up slowly, unsteady but obedient now. He went down the hallway to the bedroom, the sound of drawers opening and closing echoing through the house. Each sound felt like punctuation, a sentence finally ending. While he packed, the female officer spoke with my mother about options, reports, protection orders, resources. Words we'd never been allowed to use before floated through the kitchen like foreign language slowly becoming understandable. I watched my mother listen, truly listen. Her shoulders trembled, her voice broke. She admitted things in fragments as if saying them all at once might shatter her completely. The officer didn't rush her, didn't judge, just nodded and waited. That patience felt radical. When my father returned with a single bag, he looked diminished, smaller in every sense. He avoided my gaze, avoided my mother's. At the door, he stopped, as if expecting someone to stop him. No one did. As the officers escorted him outside, he turned back once. His eyes met mine. There was no rage there anymore, no arrogance, just a raw, unprotected understanding. Fear, not of punishment, of irrelevance. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No slam, no explosion, just an ending. The officers left soon after, promises of follow-up, papers on the table, numbers to call. When the house was finally empty again, the silence settled differently than ever before. It wasn't tense, it wasn't waiting. It simply was. My mother sank into a chair and cried. Deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere ancient. I sat beside her, letting her lean into me. For once, I didn't feel like a child holding up an adult. I felt like two people breathing the same air after nearly drowning. I didn't think it could end, she whispered. It doesn't have to be like this anymore, I said. She nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but open. Later that night, when she finally went to bed, I stood alone in the living room. The room where fear had lived for so long, where voices had echoed and bodies had learned how to brace. I realized something then, something quiet and profound. He hadn't left because I was stronger than him. He left because I stopped accepting the rules he'd written. And finally, he understood. He came back once. Not that night. Not the next day. A week later, when the house had started to relearn what breathing felt like. When silence stopped making my shoulders tense. When my mother began opening windows in the morning instead of hiding behind closed curtains. I was the one who saw him first. His car idled across the street, engine running, like he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to turn it off. He sat there for several minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house as if it were something that had betrayed him, or something he'd lost ownership of without understanding how. My body reacted before my mind did. Heart rate up, focus sharp. But there was no panic, no urge to hide, just readiness. My mother was in the kitchen, making tea. Ordinary movements, ordinary sounds. I didn't want to frighten her, so I waited until he knocked. The sound was different from all the others I remembered. No pounding, no entitlement. Just a hesitant, almost polite knock that felt wrong on this door. I opened it myself. He stood there with the same single bag he'd left with, looking like time had finally caught up to him. His clothes were wrinkled, his face gray around the edges. His eyes darted past me, instinctively checking for permission he no longer had. "I need my things," he said. No greeting, no apology, just a request, stripped of authority. "You can take what's yours," I replied. "I'll be here." That mattered. He knew it. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The house reacted to him like a body remembering an illness. The air shifted. The walls felt closer. My mother appeared in the doorway, froze, then straightened. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just stood there, visible. He avoided looking at her. He moved through the rooms slowly, collecting objects that suddenly seemed ridiculous in their importance. Clothes, tools, an old watch. Each item went into the bag like proof that he still existed, that he'd once been someone here. At one point, he stopped in the living room, staring at the couch. The place where he'd passed out so many nights, where he'd shouted, where he'd decided he was king of a kingdom built on fear. "I never meant for it to get that bad," he muttered. The sentence hung in the air, unfinished, waiting. I didn't respond. He turned toward me then, irritation flashing briefly in his eyes. "You think you're better than me now?" "No," I said calmly. "I think I'm done." The simplicity of it disarmed him. There was nothing to argue with, no accusation to defend against, no opening to exploit. My mother finally spoke. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. "You can't come back," she said. "Please don't ask again." He stared at her, stunned, as if hearing her voice without apology was more shocking than being forced out of the house. For years, she had been his safety net, his justification, his silence. Now she was standing. Something in him collapsed then. Not dramatically, not violently, just a slow deflation of whatever illusion he'd been living inside. "Fine," he said. "I'll go." He slung the bag over his shoulder and walked toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped. "You think you won?" he said, without turning around. I considered the word. Won. "This wasn't a competition," I said. "It was survival." He nodded once, as if storing that information somewhere he'd never look at again, and stepped outside. That time, when the door closed, it felt permanent. Days passed, then weeks. His calls stopped. His name stopped being spoken in the house like a curse. The fear he'd left behind didn't vanish instantly. It lingered in habits, in flinches, in the way my mother still lowered her voice on the phone, but it loosened its grip. We cleaned the house together. Not aggressively, not as an act of erasure, just quietly, carefully, room by room. We threw out empty bottles, washed old curtains, rearranged furniture. With every small change, the space became less his. One evening, my mother sat across from me at the table and said, "I don't know who I am without him." I didn't rush to reassure her. That was important. "Then you get to find out," I said. She nodded slowly, eyes distant. Not afraid, just uncertain. Which was still better than trapped. As for me, I slept better than I ever had. Not perfectly. I still startled at loud sounds, still woke sometimes with my jaw clenched, muscles ready. But when I opened my eyes, there was no immediate calculation of danger. No need to listen for keys. One night, as I lay awake, it hit me. He was gone. Not just physically, psychologically. He no longer lived in my head, measuring my worth, defining my limits. His exit hadn't been loud. It had been final. And for the first time in my life, the future felt quiet in the right way. Peace didn't arrive like a celebration. It came quietly, almost suspiciously, like a guest who didn't want to draw attention to themselves. At first, I didn't trust it. I kept waiting for the familiar tension to creep back in, for the air to thicken, for my body to remember a danger that no longer lived here. But days passed, then more days, and nothing exploded. Mornings became predictable in the best possible way. My mother woke up early and made coffee without checking the clock, without listening for footsteps that weren't coming. She started humming sometimes, softly at first, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to make noise without permission. Then louder, freer. The house breathed differently. I noticed how much space there actually was, how sunlight moved across the walls, how rooms felt larger when fear wasn't occupying them. We repainted the living room, not to erase the past, but to mark the present. The old color had absorbed too much. We chose something warm, something neutral, something that didn't carry memories in its shade. People talk about healing like it's linear, like you wake up one day and feel whole. That's a lie. Healing was uneven. Some nights I still startled awake, heart racing, muscles tense, ready for a threat that wasn't there. Sudden noises made my stomach drop. Raised voices on the street pulled my attention instantly, my body preparing itself before my mind caught up. But the difference was this: I knew I could handle it. Fear still existed, but it no longer defined my boundaries. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel victorious. Mostly, I felt grounded, solid in a way I'd never experienced before. The Army hadn't taught me how to fight. It had taught me how to stand, how to remain present under pressure, how to trust my body and my judgment. That mattered more than any confrontation. My mother started therapy. That alone felt monumental. Watching her talk about herself without framing everything around him was like watching someone learn a new language. She struggled. She backtracked. Sometimes she cried and said she still missed him. Not him, exactly, but the version of him she'd hoped for. I didn't judge her. Love doesn't disappear just because it was misused. What mattered was that she didn't confuse love with permission anymore. One evening, she looked at me across the table and said, "I should have protected you." The words hung between us, heavy and fragile. "You survived," I said. "So did you. That counts for something." She nodded, tears in her eyes. Not the quiet, apologetic tears I'd grown up with. These were honest, uncontrolled, alive. As for my father, he became a distant fact. A name mentioned only when paperwork required it. A shadow that no longer reached us. I didn't hate him anymore. Hatred takes energy. I didn't forgive him either. Forgiveness wasn't necessary for freedom. What mattered was that he no longer had access. I stayed home longer than I planned, not because I felt trapped, but because I chose to be there. Choice changes everything. I helped my mother rebuild a sense of normalcy. I rebuilt my own. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. My posture was different, my eyes steadier. There was weight to my presence, not aggression, certainty. I wasn't the girl who learned how to be afraid quietly. I was someone who understood her limits and enforced them. There are still moments when the past taps on my shoulder, a smell, a sound, a memory that surfaces without warning. I acknowledge it. Then I let it pass. I don't owe it my life anymore. I don't think of myself as strong because strength implies comparison, like someone has to lose for you to win. I think of myself as unmovable, and I know this with absolute clarity. If someone ever raises a hand again, toward me, toward someone I love, it won't end the way it once did. Fear taught me how to survive, but choosing myself taught me how to live.